Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. This episode, our guest is Michaela Mistal, Vice Principal, Center Mountain Lellum Middle School in Langford, British Columbia, School District 62. In her anti-racism work at school, Michaela emphasizes the need for principals and vice principals to listen with humility in a conversation of curiosity. We love that term. She's intentional about building connections with students and all parts of the school community.
This episode is brought to you by the verb reflection. In school, it's a way for students to internalize their physical actions into mental operations, and it's crucial for developing higher order thinking skills and abstract reasoning. Reflecting on that a bit more, it is rather introspective, isn't it?
At the end of this episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca, where you can find some great ideas for leadership in schools from a restorative relational perspective. And if you enjoy this episode, make sure you subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Now let's head over to that conversation with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. What advice would you give to somebody who is thinking about or just got into that role?
Talk to others and connect and listen. Listen to your teachers, listen to your EAs. They know all the things. And connect with your other principals and vice principals. I'm also involved in a mentorship program here, which has been absolutely incredible. Because it's humbling and you think you know things and you jump in and it's wild and it's different every day. Yesterday, the day started with a broken nose. Today there's less blood, but more other things going on. So you just never know, which is part of what I love about the position, but also if you go in with a plan for what you want to have in the day, it's probably not going to happen.
We know that if we have laid some groundwork of positive connections, that when issues or concerns come up, it's going to be easier to have conversations because we have some other connections. So is there some intentionality for you around making connections?
There is, but being intentional, but also being open to all the people. Because all of a sudden, like I had a kiddo in my office last week and I hadn't seen them at all this year. And I'm like, who are you and why are you here? And all of us, right? So those kiddos who also fly under the radar and the quiet ones and the ones that are off to the side also need to make sure that you see them. So that takes time, right? It takes time, but it's really important, I think, to see everybody, because everybody's going to need something at one point.
I wonder, in the middle of a situation, say a tense situation, maybe you can speak to an example of this, when someone comes in hot in terms of a conflict or something like that, how do you remind yourself, or how do you go back to that question, which I think is an excellent one? What does it mean to be human?
I love the question, and I'm still in touch with some of my former students who are in their 20s now, and they're still going, I still don't know. Isn't that beautiful that you're still wrangling with this question that I posed to you when you were 13? Mm-hmm. And then when students come in or when families come in to my office and say there's been a dispute or there's been racialized language or anything, it's okay, let's dive deeper into that. What is the behavior telling us? And where is it coming from? And where could we back up to make a different decision? How can we change the trajectory and learn from it? Because you're going to make mistakes. We have to make mistakes. Where can we go from this? And having that mutual understanding.
You mentioned that your district has been fairly constant, but recently has experienced a lot of change. As a leader, dealing with staff that are used to having things fairly constant, all this change creates a lot of turmoil and some stress. How do you as a leader deal with long-standing staff, for example, or long-standing traditions in the face of the change and the newcomers?
That's an interesting question. I've done a lot of work and a lot of reflection focusing on values and values-based leadership and who we are as an educational community. What do we stand for, and where oftentimes if somebody's coming at it from a different perspective, it's okay, let's bring it back down to what are the values in what you're trying to say. So guiding it in that way and having it student focused, right? It's not about me, it's not about you, it's about what is best for our kids. And where is it, if my values and your values are the same, but the processes are different, how can we come to an understanding of why that may be? But there is a lot of, that's the easy term on the paper, because then the hard work is in those conversations, being willing to have those difficult conversations, being vulnerable in those conversations, and respectful within those conversations. And there's definitely a tension that can happen with change.
When you heard that Shelley was part of Safe Schools, you said, "Oh, I really want to pick your brain." What was it that caught your attention, and what part of Shelley's brain do you want to pick? Because we would love to join you in picking Shelley's brain.
And Stan was also part of Safe Schools, so he doesn't get off the hook there.
Oh,
Steve
well,
has lots of
Shelley's brain.
experience.
It's Shelley's brain
Yeah,
we're
okay.
talking about. Shelley's brain we want to pick.
Now
right?
we're just picking on Shelley.
Oh, okay, let's.
That's
Oh,
the whole
sorry, I got
thing.
that
Oh.
wrong again. Oh,
I think with some of our very vulnerable and at-risk students and families, how do we support that reconciliation? There's some circumstances where you have to suspend a kid, and that is the last thing that I want to do, because I believe so strongly that our kids should be here. However, when certain actions are taken by our students, we can't have that, right? So just different ways of thinking about how do we have restorative practices and a different institutional model where we are bringing our kids in and supporting them and teaching them ways in which to learn and regulate and solve conflict. What is a great model so that we can keep our kids in our building safely?
First of all, we all could talk to you about this. This has been our base of restorative practice, using restorative practices, right, as an alternative. And even when we say it's an alternative, suspensions do have to happen sometimes. Expulsions have to happen sometimes. So it's not, and in education, it's not all or nothing. They can work together, right? It's like we're never not going to suspend a kid again. But it is that, because as suspending on its own doesn't teach anybody anything, right? So the restorative practice part is the teaching piece for me. So whether that's and now you've had it, you're using restorative practices all along to solve conflict as well as build community, but now you've had an incident that you've had to suspend for. Well, using that as a re-entry, using that as a reflection sheet, using that in a conversation, it just takes it. Now we've got some learning happening there. And you talked about learning from mistakes. Mm-hmm. So this is really, it's a framework when we use the restorative questions.
Trying to change the culture of a school from one that is punitive and suspension filled to the opposite, which is using restorative practices. And one of the schools I was at the year before I got there had done almost 300 suspensions out of 600 kids. And within 3 years of changing that model and working with staff and parents and everybody else, we had that down to about 15 or 20 suspensions. And those were as we said, the ones where you just couldn't turn your back to them. It's not just about discipline either. It's about using it to build relationships in a proactive way. So we don't just use it as here's a conflict, now we're going to resolve it restoratively. It's about building a culture so that we actually reduce the number of conflicts that we need to solve.
Yeah.
And that's the real key to it. And that's the real magic of it. Is my office wasn't busy by year 4, but it was sure busy year 1 until we could turn things around.
And that sounds like after we've had to do a suspension, that's exactly what we do, is bring them in and have those restorative things and make sure that they're ready to come back through those conversations and through that reconciliation and that empowerment, because there's also there's that sense of shame or identity of I'm the bad kid. And
Yeah.
so now I get to have this street cred sort of thing. And so how can we change that narrative, especially when we look coming back to our anti-racism work, but when you're looking at institutions who historically have alienated certain peoples, to make sure that is not the learning that is coming out of it, that there is still that welcoming and that there is still that we're moving forward in a positive way. But it's tricky. It's so tricky. And then also helping teachers understand that we're not just going to suspend. Like that's not the purpose of things.
Could come up with examples of how challenging it has been to address things in a different way when the expectations are X and Y, right?
Yeah, I would say like our teachers work so hard and they give so much to their students that by the time they're at that stage of this kid can't do this and they can't do that and they can't do that, and they right, and they've got into that negative mind frame, that difficult conversation of, okay, let's stop for a minute. What can they do? And let's start to reframe from there. And that can be really difficult because by the time the teacher's coming into your office in that way, like there's a whole lot of history that we as leaders haven't been part of. And they're asking for that help and they're feeling really frustrated and they're feeling done. So they just want the child to be suspended. And so bringing that forward, and I guess that's where the intentional conversations and those relationships come in, is those antecedent events so that we can interrupt that narrative from happening right from the get-go, and making sure that our teachers are okay and that our students are okay and that our families are okay before we get to that level. And if we are there, how do we reframe? How do we bring it back so that people do feel like they are being supported?
I've already heard you speak about finding the common goal when you were talking about leadership and parents and all sorts of things. But I would say it's the same thing. Somebody comes in so frustrated, they need to be heard. They may think suspension is the answer because they're tapped out and they don't know what else to do, right? So it isn't that they believe that's a benefit to the child. Sometimes it is a breather, but breathers can come in different ways too. I keep going like this because it's the restorative questions, and it's the 5 questions that you can move through in a conversational way that help people feel heard and come up with a solution. And maybe the solution still is a suspension. Probably not as you move through it, right? If there's another way, if it's not an immediate safety thing, then it's probably something that you can come up with an alternative for.
Yeah. And even if it is, what do we do with it afterwards? I think that's the important piece.
Yes.
Let's also think about how to welcome back the family and the community or elders and role models as well to further support those kids, whether it's they have outside agencies and outside supports. Like we all need to be working together.
It's interesting that you've mentioned in the course of this conversation 3 key principles of things that we come back to again and again in our podcasts, and that is belonging and voice and agency. And it's working to reconnect students and parents in all of those areas that really become central to the work that we do. You also did an anti-racism project. You had an anti-racism film festival, I think, at your previous school. And that just leads me to ask about anti-racism work is not easy work. And what have you been able to do as a leader to make an impact on anti-racism in particular?
Yeah, that work started because there was a lot of racial slurs that were being used or expressed in various forms around the building and through different students. as well as different perspectives that were shared through some of the different community members. And so that led us to, I worked quite closely with my principal at the time and adapted the Anti-Biased Film Festival so that we had morning announcements. And for the month of January leading up to Pink Shirt Day, every week we would show a mini film and then have follow-up questions or activities or writing prompts and that kind of thing, just to start the conversation, start the vocabulary, start the perspectives throughout the whole school, so that there was a common language throughout the whole school that each student and teacher would be hearing. And it was really interesting because it was impactful in that we could also then reinforce that narrative when students would be sent to the office for racial slurs or vandalism. And we could have that conversation of, what are you actually saying? What do these words truly, what is the history? What is the etymology behind what you're saying? Is this truly what you stand for? Or are you saying it because it was something on TikTok? And then we would also reinforce it through reading different books, such as The Hate You Give is a great one, where I had one student, he would not read in class ever. And he spent a lot of time in my office. And he read 3/4 of that book, and we would talk about it, and he'd be like, this is just, and he would be able to relate to it. And then that deepened those understandings of what the perspectives were and shift the interpersonal racism that was being used for personal power within the social dynamics of middle school, and shift it so that there was an understanding behind what they were actually saying. And then we could have the real meaningful conversation for why we don't say certain things. What are the reasons, right? There's all these hidden rules. And as adults, many of us say, you just don't say that. You don't swear, you don't do this. And we often forget why are those words not allowed socially? What is the context? What is the history? What is the power dynamic that we're talking about here? And having those real conversations with middle schoolers is really powerful because they get it.
How do you spread that influence, that anti-racist approach in the work that you do with parents, let's say, or with staff?
I start with curiosity. I start with the questions. Why do you believe what you believe? And those, I think this is why I love grade 8s and grade 9s, is because when you ask a grade 8 or grade 9 those challenging questions, they will come at you and they will have answers. Whereas when we ask ourselves that, and as adults, we have a much harder time being able to identify and really think about and challenge ourselves to, why do we believe what we believe, and why do I think I am right? And so I think having those conversations of curiosity, and again, comes back to that relationship, the humility, the listening, but also having a vision and being able to shift perspectives just that little bit each time, and holding high expectations within the curiosity and within the questions.
We have a tradition that Shelley has the last word, but Steve has the third last word. Steve, do you have any third last words?
I just want to thank you, Michaela. It was interesting. The work you're doing is challenging, and stick with it. And it could be very frustrating at times, and it's well worth doing.
Thank you.
And Michaela, you get the second last word.
I would like to say thank you to all of you for reaching out. I love talking about education and leadership and our kids and our families and where we can go. I think I'm an eternal optimist, where it's okay, what can we do to get there? And we just keep plugging along, because it's hard work, it's heart work, it's humbling. So thank you.
And the last word goes to Shelley.
I love the phrase you use, and I think we may pick it up, or I will pick it up, your conversations of curiosity, because we use a curiosity stance in our teachings very often. But the conversations of curiosity is a nice way to pull it together. And I can tell you do that very authentically, which is another key piece, right? To just ask questions, to gather information comes across very differently than if you're truly curious about what people think. And then you moving it into educating people. When you talk about the student reading the book, right? And you're having conversations. So thank you very much for that.
See, and this is why we have the third last, second last, and very last words. Dealing with conflict in schools is a daily occurrence for school administrators and becomes an opportunity to promote reflection by students and staff. It's important to be able to have difficult conversations and maintain a student-focused approach in times of change in schools. Find out more about our work with restorative practices at our website, www.restorative.ca. You can send me an email to stan@restorative.ca. This is not the first time in our podcast that the word reflection has come up. Think about it and reflect again on how important that is in school leadership.